and welcome back to Tales of Faith, a podcast on the Narrative Lectionary. I'm Louise Ochart. My pronouns are she, her.
And I'm AJ Ochart. My pronouns are he, and him. This is episode 443 for the fifth Sunday of Easter, on May 3rd, 2026. Though recording on April 27th, so something major has happened between then and when we record and when you listen, we will be. Things are happening.
Today we'll be talking about Acts 17, 16 to 31, Paul's sermon in Athens. We'll be using the new Revised Standard Version Updated Edition, so let's get started with context.
All right. Overall context, I love this. Athens is the center for philosophy. Philosophical thought for the ancient world, and actually in a way that continues to inform Western thought down to today. So in Athens, you have multiple schools of thought. Here are sort of the top ones. So you have Socrates in the 5th century, inventor of the Socratic method, sort of, I'm going to ask you questions, and that sort of delves down deeper, gets to what's sort of foundational, sometimes calls attention to the stuff that is fallacies, those sorts of things. Consider that no one desires what is bad. So if anyone does something that truly is evil or bad, it must be unwillingly or out of ignorance. And consider that all virtue is knowledge. Plato was his student.
All virtue is knowledge, or all knowledge is virtue?
All virtue is knowledge. So to understand a virtue, and by virtue is, for Greek philosophy, things like, it's things that we would call virtue, sort of like to be noble or heroic, but it's also, virtue is kind of it's living out your ideals. It can be sort of following along, doing the stuff you're supposed to do, all those sorts of things. Anyways, Plato was the generation after Socrates. He was a student of Socrates, wrote in dialogues. In fact, most of what we know about Socrates comes from Plato. So parsing out who is who is hard sometimes. He was deeply metaphysical, had this idea of the realm of forms, which is sort of this place where ideas in themselves exist on a plane that is more real than sort of the material world. He gives us ideas about immutability of the human soul. Reincarnation is something that he believed was a part of what is going on. Did things like the allegory of the cave, where you sort of wake up and you see the shadows of things on the cave wall, and then you come to realize that actually the shadows are just that. They're just shadows of things that are more real, in this sort of like unlocking deeper and deeper understanding of the universe sort of stuff. Then you have Aristotle, who came about in the 4th century. He was enrolled as a student in Plato's academy, became a tutor of Alexander the Great, and then returned back to Athens and established the Lyceum. And he very much didn't like Plato's view of sort of this idea of a realm of forms. He very much was more about empirical evidence. What can you measure? Very much sort of materialist. Considered that life is valuable, also suggested that resources should be shared and allocated to reduce poverty. You also have the Epicureans, who, interestingly enough, believed in atomism, which is what we get the word atom of, sort of like that everything is made up of little bits, and believe that the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain is sort of the ultimate goal. They're not quite hedonists where like everything goes, but just in general, you should just enjoy life. That was sort of the idea. And then you also had the Stoics in the 3rd century, who applied the concept of apatheia or indifference to personal circumstances rather than social norms. Also, very materialist, living in accordance with nature. Um, their sort of place of power, the place that they would hang out, would be the agora or the marketplace. Um, so all of these sorts of things and all sorts of others um, are are at work in Athens, part of the history, part of the just ongoing work. In fact, there's like an artist depiction of you could be on the porch or on the steps of the academy, Plato's academy, and you could see the agora where the Stoics were hanging out. You could see the other place where the Epicureans were hanging out. You could see the Lyceum where the students of Aristotle were. So, I mean, everything happening in really close by proximity. And it's also about 15 miles from the center of sort of religious and, as we are uncovering, more sort of like psychedelic experiences that you would go and have these sort of like experiences and see things. Not unlikely that that's kind of where Plato got some of his stuff. Anyways, in the Book of Acts, we're skipping over a little bit after um, Paul and Silas get run out of Philippi. They go to Thessalonica, where they get run out of town as well. They go to Berea. They have a decent reception. Some of y'all might remember Berean bookstores. These were the folks who said, "Oh, thanks for telling us about this. We're going to go investigate and we're going to read about it." And then some folks from Thessalonica showed up and said, "Oh, those guys suck. You should get rid of them." So then they went away. Uh, at that point, Silas and Timothy send Paul to the coast while they finish things up in Berea. So now Paul is in Athens. He's basically waiting around for um, Silas and Timothy to get finished with their work in Berea. You know, so that's that's where. Cool. Questions, comments, thoughts?
Today's episode is brought to you today by Pascalism.
Mhm. Perfect. You pretty sure that you follow the correct religious teaching, but that little bit wonders. Do you generally reject any non-materialistic view of the universe, but wouldn't mind making a side bet on the spiritual without all the messy ethical implications? Why not try Pascalism, just in case? We'll add you to the list so that you have an eternal backup plan.
Named after 17th century philosopher Blaise Pascal, who suggested that it is logically beneficial to wager on the existence of God.
Oh wait, not Pedro Pascal?
No, Blaise Pascal.
This is not the
Anyways, there's all of your bases with Pascalism.
way. Had to do philosophy. All right. Yeah.
Section 1, Acts 17:16 to 21. Let's find something to do while we're waiting. And I'm so sorry. I'm so stuffy. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was deeply distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he argued in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and also in the marketplace, every day with those who happened to be there. Also, some Epicureans and Stoic philosophers debated with him. Some said, "What does this pretentious babbler want to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign divinities." This was because he was telling the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. So they took him and brought him to the Areopagus and asked him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are pressing? It sounds rather strange to us, so we would like to know what it means." Now all Athenians and foreigners living there would spend their time in nothing but telling or hearing something new. I very seriously
The
doubt
shade cast.
that all Athenians. There's a lot of Athenians that are working. They're just not. Just saying.
Yeah, that's probably very true. Um, yeah, so the setup is he's looking around, he sees all these idols, he sees all of these temples, and for a Jewish guy from Tarsus, this is a lot. These are a lot of idols, these are a lot of gods. He's grown up with a lot of rhetoric um against idol worship and all of these sorts of things. So it's a culture shock is part of it. Um and he's cantankerous, right?
Yeah.
He's arguing with literally everybody. He's arguing with the Jews in the synagogue. He's arguing with people in the marketplace. He's arguing with Epicureans. He's arguing with the Stoics. He's all of this sort of stuff.
I like the what is this pretentious babbler?
I thought you would like that. Yeah. And yeah, maybe he's a proclaimer of foreign deities, because he's telling them about Jesus. So they take him to the Areopagus with sort of an opportunity to say, like, hey, why don't you tell us all what you believe, and then let's talk about it. Let's have this conversation. Um, it sounds rather strange to us, and we want to know what it means. And we have this again, sort of editorial note from the writer that the Athenians, um, so all, and that's a good point, probably all Athenians of a particular class, living, and all the foreigners living there would spend their time in nothing but telling or hearing something. Part of the other sort of culture clash here is, in general, Jewish, the Jewish mindset is, if your idea is good, it needs to be really old. It needs to be ancient. It needs to come from, like, we need to have passed this on for generations upon generations upon generations. It has to sort of ferment, and we still talk about it and consider, and what does this rabbi say, and what does this scripture say, and all that sort of stuff. Whereas it seems that the Athenian viewpoint is, that there's value in something new, and maybe even the opposite. Maybe not quite to the same extent as in our culture, where it tends to be like, if it's more than 5 years old, it's outdated. Like, we just throw it away. Just what's the newest. Um, Athenians probably in the middle there, but sort of this idea of, yeah, we are interested in new ideas. This is this place where all of these schools of thought have risen up, and so there's this desire to understand these things. And what are you talking about, right? Which, from the perspective of the writer, is like, these dummies, they're wasting their time because they're only listening to things that are new, not things that so.
And yet Jesus was new. So.
Yeah. Which, again, given the reception, like, that's part of the problem is, no, you have all of these weird new ideas. We don't like it. You are understanding uh, how the law is applied in a new way. We don't like it. Like, get out of here.
Yeah. No, I'm just saying, as an author,
Oh yeah.
it's a little ironic because
Yeah.
you are writing about a relatively new.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, it has roots the in the Torah and the Scripture, and that's where it comes from. But
Yeah.
the actual Messiah is new, and here you are casting shade on these
Yeah.
people. I mean, the other thing is, again, just one of my issues with Paul is like he just storms in and wants everybody to change everything because he doesn't like it. And I think this is where we as Christians get this idea that we get to dictate to everybody who does what and how they do it, and you're not worshiping right. I don't think that that should be over there, and there's only one way, and this is the way, and um, because this is kind of what Paul does.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's not to say that we should not share our faith.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, you know, the ways in which Paul goes about it, I think, often are problematic especially in today's world. The in a world where they said, "Hey, just come in and like let's just share ideas,"
Mhm.
but we've taken that and twisted it into a not sharing ideas. I'm telling you the right way to do things. And I think that to some degree, I do think that that's what Paul is doing. Is he's not here just to share what he thinks. He's here to tell you that you're doing it wrong. Just he's just here arguing with everybody about what they're doing wrong.
Yeah. Now, part of that is also this sort of like, especially the Pharisaical tradition. That's a lot of it. It's a lot of the sort of style is to argue and to sort of debate and consider and um, a lot of this back and forth, which to a certain extent seems to sort of jive well with um, this Athenian mindset of let's talk these things through. But this is kind of the way that he has grown up engaging with these conversations of yeah, let's debate interpretation of Torah. Let's go through these things. But certainly, yeah,
Yeah.
he's come into a very different context and says like, "Hey, wait a second, what's going on here?" Um,
Well, but I don't think I think that's my point is he doesn't ask questions. He comes in and tells you what you're doing wrong. And I think that's the approach that I think is a little problematic. It's not I don't get the sense that many of Paul's conversations were conversations. They're very much more one sided.
well, and partially we'll see what we'll see how he
And to be
addresses
fair,
all
like
of
I
these.
actually do think this is like what he's going to say is not
Mhm.
bad.
Yeah.
I do think that there's a lot of really good things especially in this particular, because I do know where we're going into. I'm just saying, like again, our approach could use some work, and what we take from it, we need to be cautious of. That we as Christians look at this and go, well, Paul just walked in and he just told him what for what. But is that the right approach? Uh, I don't think that that's always because I think this is where we get a lot of our uh, idea that Christianity should be the end all and be all, and
Right.
there should be no other, that we have the rights in government to use our Christianity as to make laws. And, I think that that's where some of this comes from. When we look at the early church, and mainly when we say that, we're looking at Paul's ministry. He just went in and bulldozed over people. Uh, like, he's here arguing with a bunch of Jews and literally like about something that's not that like I get the sense that he's just like, well, that thing over there shouldn't be here, and the Jewish guy's like, it's not my like, what do you want me to do about it? You know, uh, it's just it it's the approach that I think we need to be cautious.
Um, yeah. So so we'll see how he actually um, addresses this, because up to this point we actually don't have anything about what he says.
Right.
Um, we only have
That's what.
people's
Yeah.
responses.
Which is why what I said was that it's not necessarily bad what he's going to get into, but the approach is problematic. So I think that that's
All right, section 2, Acts 17:22 to wherever we end this one. 31, which is actually the end of our actual pericope. In him we live and move and have our being. Then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, Athenians, I see how extremely spiritual you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, To an unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you, that God, who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor, he made all peoples to inherit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps fumble about for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals. While God has overlooked the times of human ignorance, now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will have the world judged in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Um, and I usually degender pronouns for God, but I specifically didn't here because of kind of the way that Paul is using the language. So, um, something to pay attention to. There are two quotes here, for in whom him we live and move and have our being, and for we are indeed his offspring. So the first one likely comes from Epimenides of Crete, who was a semi-mythical 6th century Cretan philosopher. And the other one comes from likely from Aratus or Phenomena in 315 to 240 BCE, who was a more of a Stoic perspective. So he's pulling from specifically Greek poetry, um, and both of them are direct references to Zeus. So sort of using this idea. The first one is a poem that sort of marks Zeus as sort of omnipotent, and all knowing and all this sort of stuff, sort of high above us. And the second one is interestingly, again, from the Stoic perspective, a view of Zeus, or sometimes they would use Logos, which we saw in John's Gospel, as sort of again, the ground of all being, the foundation on which all of creation has come. So using these quotations that they would be familiar with, but he's sort of pulling from them and attributing these things about Zeus to the God
To
of
God.
the Israelites.
Right.
Oh yeah, those are notes more for me so I could remember
Yeah,
where
no, I was just reading through them.
Yeah, so the overall flow, he starts with this sort of praising them for their spirituality. Um, we get the sense earlier that he sees all of these idols and he doesn't, we don't get the sense that he's a fan of this situation. It's not a good thing. This is not something I like. But the way that he sort of addresses it to them is much more sort of um,
It's more generous.
yeah, generous. That's
Yeah.
the word I'm thinking of. That look, you're very spiritual. I get it. I like that's something that you're doing. Um, and then this famous sort of pulling on this very particular idol or altar that he comes across that is inscribed to an unknown God. Um, I have heard tell, but I don't know how correct it is. But there's a possibility that there's sort of like this comes from Crete as a reference, maybe if you squint your eyes to the Hebrew God. The sort of they encounter this God that doesn't have idols and doesn't have anything else, and so they're like, well, yep, we'll go ahead and have an altar to him just in case. Sort of that Pascal's wager type thing.
Yeah, I'm just listening.
And then there's sort of, again, this is one of the speeches that we see from Paul that is, like you see the rhetorical moves. Because then he goes from this altar to an unknown God to this, hey, this thing that you don't know, this unknown God, I'm proclaiming to you as a thing that is known.
Right.
The God who made the world and everything in it, who's Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands. And he goes in, like making from one ancestor all of the people that inhabit the earth, allotting the times in their existence and the boundaries. And then this is the place that he starts to quote from their poets, this sort of idea of a God who is foundational to everything. In this way that sort of is saying this sort of like you call it's an interesting rhetorical thing because he's saying this thing that you don't know, I'm going to proclaim as something that is known. And the knownness is sort of, I know this thing, but also you know this thing. You understand this God. These are things that you have attributed to Zeus, but I'm telling you it's sort of something even deeper. But it is known to you as well. It's this ground of all being. That's this one that we are an offspring to. And since we are God's offspring, since we come from God, well, then we shouldn't think that this deity is gold or silver or stone. That there's something deeper. Like it's not a God like that could not be contained in these material things. And then finishing up with this sort of idea that that there has been a time when we could sort of worship in ignorance. We could think that we understand, but maybe don't actually understand. Maybe we're grasping. But now there's a a command from this God that people everywhere are to repent because there's going to be judgment. And then he gets to Jesus, the righteous, judged in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And the final sort of proof is that he has raised him from the dead. Any thoughts? Nothing?
No, I mean, I think this is one of Paul's better speeches. It does it's less didactic and circular, which I often get from Paul. Um, and I appreciate that he is using things that are familiar to explain something. It just, again, it ends in judgment as opposed to following a loving God. And so that's kind of where you lose me a bit. And really the judgment seems to just be about the idols.
Yeah, the sort of, you've been worshiping in ignorance. Now worship sort of the true God that is foundational to all things.
Yeah. But I would say my favorite part of this is that God is not far from each of us. Um, but then there's this idea that it's a test to find God. That God is somehow setting a test before us.
Is that from getting that from the
I mean,
searching for God and
yeah,
perhaps fumble about to find him?
It's from one ancestor he made all peoples to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps fumble about for him and find him. Though indeed he is not far from each of us. But instead, I mean, this was an opportunity to say we are searching for God, and God has come to us in the form of Christ. Like, I don't. It just.
So I read it a little bit more, maybe in the frame of a lot of these other sort of philosophical writings and thoughts. The sort of idea that the real truth is right there. You do have to work for it a little bit. All the way back to Socrates and the sort of, well, let me ask you some questions and let's get deeper and further. Or Plato and the sort of idea that this thing that we call chair has there is a greater ideal of chair. There's a greater ideal of all of the things that we experience that is sort of deeper than the shadows that we see in front of us. Um,
yeah, I mean, I guess it just in reading this,
Mhm.
I don't see that. I'm reading it again, and
Mhm.
I think what I want it to be and what I'm seeing it as are two
Mhm.
different things.
Mhm.
I want it to be a more inclusive and more of a C.S. Lewis, when you pray to God, God is there.
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
Lewis's more idea of like, if you are searching for God,
Mhm.
you are finding God.
Mhm.
You may call God something different,
Mhm.
but because you are searching, God is meeting you there,
Mhm.
even if you call God by a different name. And I think that's sort of what I always felt that this was with the inscription to the unknown God,
Mhm.
but I'm not really seeing that this time.
Mhm.
It is feeling much more like really his argument against statues. That God is bigger than statues, which is
Mhm.
true,
Mhm.
but I'm not seeing the like. I mean, for in him we live and move and have our being
Mhm.
is, I think, is the closest that I get to a vision of a kind and loving, generous God who has provided a path to themselves through Christ.
Mhm.
But I don't know. It just there's something that's
Mhm.
it's
Well, and yeah, I wonder if we're just way too early for that.
yeah.
Um, I mean, C.S. Lewis has the benefit of 1900 years of theological sort of reflection on this, whereas this is relatively early, and so it's maybe a little bit more clunky.
Right.
We don't have.
I think the other part is the nor is he served by human hands as though he needs anything
Mhm.
is sort of bothersome to me.
Mm.
Um,
In that it's sort of over spiritualization, maybe, or.
no, it's just incredibly dismissive
Mm.
that there's nothing we can do to serve God.
Yeah.
And I don't. I think the point that he's making here is that we can't create something,
Mhm.
right? Because again, this is an argument about idols,
Mhm.
but I don't know. It comes off a little bit. Um, Dismissive of the partnership that we have with God.
Mm.
What comes directly after this?
We've got
You do
the
go, okay.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, and maybe that's part of it is it's feeling very I don't and it's not even that it feels very philosophical to me because I think that's like I'm not seeing a whole lot of that. I don't know. There's just some things that are just not hitting quite right. I'm just not 100% sure of the point that Paul is making.
Yeah, it's not. There's not a solid. I mean, it's the sort of unknown God is one that I know who's like Zeus, who has the foundation of being, and will judge all by this one who's been raised, which is like, yeah, it's not the sort of.
I mean, and there are some really beautiful things here.
Mhm,
Again, the for in him we live and move and have our
mhm,
beings, and we too are his offspring. Like those things are very grounding and hopeful, and so I don't want to downplay that. And
mhm,
I've always liked this idea of like uh the unknown God, that you've
mhm.
worshipped God without knowing.
Right. Yeah.
Um, and I think that I think that in my mind that there was more of that in this sermon,
Mhm,
and maybe that's just where I've made up something that I'm
yeah.
not getting, and so now I'm a little bit disappointed that I'm
Mhm,
not getting the thing that I made up,
yeah.
which
But
is
it,
not fair.
yeah, and part of it is again the the type of history that this is being presented in here is like this is a pretty standard-ish kind of like big speech that somebody gives in one
Right.
of these histories. We've seen lots of them, and we see lots of them in Acts. We see lots of them in these sort of histories of the day. Um, and you know, this is 10 verses long. I guarantee you that Paul in front of the Areopagus does not speak 10 verses worth.
Right.
This is going to be like a 3-hour lecture or whatever.
Right.
Um, and so it's sort of the, oh, let's tie this down. Like it's a real quick sort of like boom, 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 boom. Um, if Paul were to have given this actual speech, it would be much more full. It would be much more sort of circular,
Right.
like
I mean,
like
I appreciate
his
that we didn't
writing.
have to listen to the
Yeah,
same argument 7 different times in the exact same words because Paul likes to hear him talk. Uh,
and also a lot of like the letters were yes written down, but also intended to be an oral experience where you're sitting there and listening.
yeah.
So when you hear something the third time is very different than when you're reading it the third time. So some of that sort of repetition is intentional. Um, and but all of that sort of fluff is not here. It's
No.
just boom, boom, boom.
I mean, I guess
Here are the points.
what are you getting from this? What are you feeling? Where
Um, I think one of the things that is most interesting to me is this um, as an exploration of how do you do sort of cross cultural communication.
Mhm.
Um, he doesn't come in with a bunch of jargon.
Mhm.
He doesn't come in with a big sort of theological thing. He doesn't even come in with a big like condemnation of y'all have this wrong. Um, he pulls from, as you noted, from their experience. Here's this, maybe you've seen it too, but there was this idol. He pulls from And I agree. Some of the most sort of like beautiful and memorable things here are actually quotes from 500 years before him. Um, the sort of ground of being on which we can build a whole theological treatise of the sort of the very fabric of the cosmos is divine. Um, and there is a really nice sort of reaching out and saying, here are things that you have understood.
Mhm.
Here is, from a missiological standpoint, it is an expectation that God has already been at work in and among you. Um, your poets said this thing. Now, they called it Zeus. I'm proclaiming to you that it's something different. Um, but it's this sort of toehold. And again, like from a missiological standpoint, places where um, mission is colonization, where we come in and say, you know, African tribe, you need to worship God, and what worshiping God means is you have to dress in a suit and tie and sing hymns in English. Um, Perhaps unsurprisingly, that's not where the gospel takes root. The places where it takes root is when people come in and say, like, let me understand your culture. Let me understand where you're coming from. And then I'm going to translate and relate this into your culture. What is what is this deep understanding of Ubuntu for you? And how is this sort of God's wisdom that has been revealed? Um, and the history of the gospel being translated gives us these new and unique perspectives on who God is because we're getting to see it from a different um, perspective. This ground of being theology, this idea of God as this, again, sort of the very fabric of reality, is not something that is sort of native to Jewish theology. It's this blending of Jewish and Greek. This idea of Jesus as Lord is a blending of Jewish understandings of Messiah plus sort of this lordship sort of stuff from Roman culture. And as the gospel is translated into these different cultures, we get these different perspectives and ways of understanding, and sometimes they can be less helpful. Sometimes we go, some of that Roman stuff we're still dealing with, that imperial theology, but a generous view of God has been at work among you, and here I'm going to proclaim to you this thing that you didn't know that you knew, but you actually do. You actually do see it, um, and it's right here. It's right um, at your fingertips. I think, like it's a blending of a lot of those different things. Is it the best speech sermon? No, it's not. But there's some cool nuggets here. Um, which is a little bit more sort of the preachy stuff, but um, that's what I see here. Um, it's a yeah, cross-cultural um, articulation and what is gained in that. So, anything else?
No.
So this is not part of the pericope, but um, I did include the rest of chapter 17 to
Sorry. All right. Acts 17:32 to 34. Mixed reviews. When they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some scoffed, but others said, "We will hear you again about this." At that point, Paul left them, but some of them joined him and became believers, including Dionysius and the Areopagite and a woman named Demarius and others with them.
nice. Um, Something that just occurred to me, which is sort of a theme throughout Acts as well, is this sort of idea that some of the people hear this resurrection thing and they go like, "Oh gosh, how plebeian, how like stupid," and others go, "Oh yeah, that sounds really interesting." Um, Another interesting sort of perspective on you have these Greek perspectives, but as Israel, Judea was becoming Hellenized, these thoughts and these sort of ideas were shifting around, and in many ways, the Pharisees were much more Platonic with this sort of idea of deeper spiritual truths and sort of the universe being more than just material, um, the immortality of souls, the sort of idea of everything coming back again, um, and so they were the ones that believed, you know, there's going to be this final resurrection in which judgment's going to happen. They believed in the immortality of souls. They believed in angels. They believed in miracles. They believed all this sort of stuff, right? And the Sadducees, for the most part, were more kind of inspired by this Stoic philosophy of, or Aristotle. Like, no, 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 all that's just a bunch of malarkey. There's the material world, and that's it. Can you measure it? Great, then it exists. If you can't measure it, if you don't see it, it doesn't exist. And so you have that same sort of parallel of material and immaterial, and continues to persist, right? Um, the at least perceived whatever war between religion and science is that same thing. It's material and a non-material world. Um, so, anyways.
Yeah.
Next week, we're going to be looking at Philippians chapter 1. So, in the sort of history or the sort of biography of Paul, he continues to do ministry, ends up back in Jerusalem where he gets into a lot of trouble. There's a mob that wants to kill him. He gets arrested for his own protection. He appeals to sort of the next court and then keeps on going up all the way up to appealing as a Roman citizen to Caesar. This is all according to Acts. And eventually gets to Rome, where he is then under house arrest, uh, according to sort of church tradition, until his death, though there are some who suggest that maybe eventually he got out and went and did some other stuff. Um, and this is the place from which he writes to that church in Philippi that we read about last week. And so that's the context for this letters to the Philippians that we'll have. So, So like we'll hear about his imprisonment and that. So sermon thoughts.
I mean, we're just gonna read it. I'm
Yeah,
not gonna.
yeah.
I don't think I'm gonna draw their attention to anything in particular. I'd like to see where they
Mm-hmm.
go with it. See what they think. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe to add on to what I was saying before about sort of this cross cultural um, translation. Part of that is also recognizing how do we communicate the gospel, um, and part of that is to translate it and recognize it in contexts that are not our own. Now that can be from, you know, what can we learn from people who call God by the same name, right? Because that could be vastly different. I think there's a huge amount that we in the white church can learn from, say, the black church, a church that is um, has been deeply oppressed and knows how to praise and pray in ways that we don't always. There's a lot of issues I think in the Pentecostal church, but you know what? As we as Presbyterians can learn a lot about the Spirit from some of our siblings who are not us. Um, so there's that, but then also the how do we understand these deep truths as they're translated into um, um, there's a great book drawing outside the lines, I think it's what it's called, Minhee Kimcourt, um, that talks about sort of like what are some things in queer culture that can help us to understand more deeply our identity as things like found family and what does coming out mean, and what does it mean in a sort of belief standpoint, those sorts of things. um, uh, Grace G. Jisun Kim, I think that's her last name, has done some beautiful, amazing work in specifically Korean culture and wider sort of Asian culture of these deep um, sort of concepts that can help us understand more about ourselves and spirituality and um, um, those sorts of things. How can we look at these these ways that the gospel has been translated, and what is gained and what sometimes what is lost as well, um, separating again sort of mission and colonialism, but also how do we then I'm really interested in how do we use pop culture, for instance, as ways to understand. Um, there are rich images and metaphors of what is the Jedi and Padawan relationship, and how is that similar to a lot of things that we see in Scripture that we have lost from our culture, um, those sorts of things. So, I'm not sure how that comes in together in a sermon, um, without some people walking away saying, um, scoffing, and others saying, "We will hear you again about this." But um, yeah, yeah, I think
Cool.
that's it.
Yeah.
So, thanks for joining us. Comment, subscribe, like, all the good things, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.